like to introduce Dr. Paula J. Kaplan, who wrote this wonderful book called When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home. When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home tells the stories of the struggle of today's generations of veterans who really need some help, and not just the traditional help from the VA. We all know that a lot of the veterans coming out of the military are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you tell me what that is, Dr.?
Well, yes, actually, I have to say, this is about veterans from all wars, too.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of veterans from World War II on who, as you know, are still suffering terribly. And I have to, if I could say something about the term post-traumatic stress disorder, which I know a lot of vets use for themselves, because a lot of people don't take you seriously if you don't say you have PTSD. And so it's a kind of a shorthand way that people use for saying, I'm having a really rough time, right? But I want people to know that the term post-traumatic stress disorder was created with very good intentions, which was that when the vets from Vietnam were being ignored, their suffering was not being paid attention to, people with good intentions said, well, let's create a whole diagnostic category, a psychiatric label, call it PTSD, and let's get it in the psychiatric manual.
So part of the logic for that is it's a way to assist veterans in getting a service-connected disability rating from the VA.
That's right, that's right. That was part of the intention. The problem is this, that anybody who's been to war, or anybody who's been traumatized in any way, knows that to be horribly upset is a natural human reaction. It's not a mental illness. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means something awful happened to you. And the problem is that once you say you have a psychiatric problem, then all sorts of terrible things can be done to you.
And some of those things are, if you are given a diagnosis with PTSD and you get a service-connected disability rating, sometimes that prevents you from getting a federal job.
It prevents you from getting a federal job. You can lose or fail to get security clearance. You can have all kinds of employment problems. You can just feel terrible about yourself because instead of people saying to you, of course you're suffering, look what you've been through, and I want to help in any way I can, they say, oh, you're mentally ill, which leads to a lot of shame, a lot of hopelessness. I know vets who have been told, you have PTSD and you'll always have it, so just live with it. Well, that's not a very humane approach.
Well, and I thought the whole idea of helping veterans is either, if you can't cure it, at least teach them to cope with it.
Yes, that's such a good point. When we talk about cure, I mean, if I just said to you, forget about veterans specifically for a moment, if I just tell you some person had a terrible loss they experienced, would you think, well, we'll be able to cure them from that? Or would you say just what you said, which is, well, you have to help them learn how to live with that and how to go on. And one way of not helping is to say, let's give them a psychiatric drug and then another psychiatric drug. I know so many veterans who have been put on not just one psychiatric drug, but 3, 6, even 12. And General Corelli, now retired, has publicly expressed alarm about the dangers of many of these drugs.
So really they're just, instead of really offering, I've got to be careful how I say this, the VA does a lot of great work, but there is an issue of over-medicating the veterans.
Absolutely.
And where do you draw the line between really issuing the proper medication, but not doing it in a way to where the veterans are over-drugged and they don't feel that they can contribute to society? Because see, this is what we're trying to do, is how do you get veterans out of the house? How do you get them out of hiding? How do you get them out of being isolated and that feeling of being depressed and overwhelmed and that no one can relate to what I've been through? Mm-hmm. How do you overcome that?
Well, that's such a good point. Most psychiatric drugs decrease the chances that they will break out of isolation because they suppress your feelings, they suppress your motivation, they suppress your thinking, Now, they do help some people sometimes, so I don't want to say nobody should ever be allowed to take a drug. What I want to say is let's start from a different point. Instead of saying right off the bat, well, anybody who's upset because of having been at war has a mental illness, whether you call it PTSD or generalized anxiety or anything else in the psychiatric handbook, let's start by saying to every vet who is struggling, of course you're struggling. That's a deeply human reaction when somebody has been through a trauma. And let's not just say PTSD, which doesn't say anything about war. Somebody can have trauma because they were in a tsunami, or because they were raped, or they were hit by a bus.
Or they experienced Hurricane Sandy and everything that's going on back east right now.
Exactly.
There's certainly everyone that's been through an extreme situation like that is suffering from some sort of PTSD.
Well, but I wouldn't call it PTSD. I want to say let's never use that term again. Let's say that person's suffering because they've been through the trauma of a hurricane. Let's say a vet walks in this room, and instead of saying we have PTSD, which is just kind of general, they're suffering, we want to say, I want to listen to what happened to you if you want to tell me, and I won't judge you. And when vets talk to other vets, it's often very helpful. But if they only ever talk to other vets, then they're in these little pockets away from the rest of the community. It increases their isolation. And there's something else very important, which is my late father was in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. And he was a forward observer at one point. And the more veteran stories I listen to from all wars, the more I come to understand that for those of us, which means more than 93% of the American population, those of us who've never been in the military, certainly never gone to war, people who've been to war are the forward observers. For the rest of us, have faced matters of life and death and moral anguish in ways that most of us never will have to. Now, I don't care what anybody's politics are, the veterans or the civilians, these are human stories, and we've got a government that keeps sending people to war. And as long as our government, in the name of 100% of us, keeps sending people over there, then all the rest of us have an obligation. The obligation is to change this country from what I call war illiterate, most of us not knowing what war really is, to war literate. And my project, the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home project, is very simple and it doesn't cost a penny. I want every single American civilian just to listen with respect and without judgment to the story of a veteran from any war. It decreases the veteran's isolation. It is the responsibility of the civilian. And you know what? The civilians who've done this have said it's transformed their lives for the better, because they've said things like, I discovered we have so much in common. Now think about that. Many civilians assume if you're a vet and I'm a civilian, we have nothing in common. What about our common humanity? And so when we isolate vets or allow vets to remain isolated from the rest of the community, we are hurting this nation in ways that we don't even begin to understand.
And being the daughter of 2 World War II veterans myself, I will tell you some of the biggest issues facing veterans are their family members and how they are coping with the veteran themselves when they come back.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Let's do. I'm so glad you brought that up. I gave a plenary session address to the American Legion Auxiliary some months ago. And of course, it was a ballroom. Almost everyone was a woman with a partner who was male. And I said, I'm so glad to get to talk to you about this because most of the burden is placed on the families. And so on the one hand, think about this. The whole country is saying vets who are upset are mentally ill, and then it's usually up to the women in the family. We're supposed to be able to fix everything, we women, right? But if people are feeling like, but I'm not a therapist, and if he's mentally ill, oh my God, I don't know what to do. So there's tremendous fear and tension.
And that's really true, because speaking from the point of view of being the daughter of a World War II veteran, a Marine Corps career enlisted man who had PTSD and never admitted it and never sought counseling for it, and how that really, I wouldn't say it ravaged our family, but what it did do, it created situations for us that were completely unnecessary. So in our way of veterans helping veterans is the government cannot take care of everybody.
Right.
They simply don't have the money. So really it is up to service providers like yourself, veteran groups like the AMVETS and American Legion, VFW, DAV, all these groups, we all exist to help veterans. So the community really does need to hear these stories. This is one of the reasons we do this TV series.
I know, and that's so wonderful. And I'm very moved by what veterans organizations are doing for veterans. But I'm very sad at the paucity of other people, other than vets and non-veteran organizations that are really doing anything that matter. And so to say, thank a vet for their service. I've had vets, some vets say, well, I appreciate that. And I've had other vets say, I don't like it when they say that, because they say it and they walk away and they think, now they've done all they need to do.
And now what?
And now what? Right. Follow through in some way. And let me say this too. When I was writing this book, one of the chapters, two of the chapters actually, are based on press releases from the military and from the VA. And what you see since the war in Afghanistan started, here's the pattern you see. The top brass in both of these institutions get up and they say, in their press releases, they say, we're very worried because the rates of suffering keep going up. The suicide rate and homelessness and substance abuse and family breakdown. And they say, so we're going to hire more therapists and prescribe more psychiatric drugs. And then guess what? The next press release, we're really upset because the rates keep going up. So they hire more therapists and they prescribe more drugs. Now they're sending therapists and embedding them in the combat zones. Now they're getting the drugs out while you're out in the combat zone. And guess what? The rates keep going up. So here's what I want to say. When you said we need more people, practitioners like me, I don't do therapy anymore. I find that listening as a human being instead of a therapist is more helpful. I find that getting vets involved in things like the arts or in politics, whatever kind of political action, or nonprofits, or meditation, or physical exercise, or my listening project is more healing, and it heals without saying you're mentally ill, and these are ways to help the vet connect with the community. So let me say it this way. Even if every therapist in the military and the VA is fabulous, and even if every drug were effective and not harmful, if you look at what the top brass are saying, more is needed. And what's needed is that community connection. And can I say one other thing?
Absolutely.
Well, there's a wonderful man named Colonel David Sutherland, and he's a recently retired Army colonel. He led a brigade in Iraq during the surge. And he now heads the Dixon Center, which is with Easter Seals. And he and his staff go around to communities all over the country. And what they'll do is, for example, they'll go to Palm Springs and they'll find out what are the different organizations that are doing things for veterans. And make sure that they learn about each other. Because in a lot of cities, they don't even know about each other. Now, right before he left the Pentagon, where he reported directly to the chair of the Joint Chiefs when it was Admiral Mullen, right before he left, he created a document called the Menu of Initiatives. And he talked about the things we always hear about that vets need. They need homes, they need jobs, they need health care. Fair enough. But what he also said was, without the human connections with people in the community, the rest of that stuff can only go so far.
And we really can't stress that enough. Right. We're reaching out to veterans, we're encouraging them. You know, there are people that want to help you. Yes. There are people that want to listen to what you have to say. Yeah. If you seek help, we'll help you. If you just want somebody to talk to, we'll listen.
Yes, and you know what? We did a study at Harvard Kennedy School, because when I started talking about the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home Project, here's what a lot of civilians would say. Well, I want to help vets, but I couldn't do the listening session because I'm not a therapist and they're mentally ill. So I say, no, they're not mentally ill, you just listen. And they say, just listen. And people have forgotten the power of respectful listening. So we did a study at Harvard Kennedy School. We had veterans from a World War II veteran who was 93 at the time, a black World War II veteran. He said nobody ever gave him the chance to tell his story in all these decades, down through veterans from all the wars that the United States has been in. And all we did was we had untrained civilian, non-therapists just sit and listen. And usually the vet would talk 2 or 3 hours. And you start the session by saying, as an American whose government sent you to war, I take some responsibility for what happened to you there and how it's been for you trying to come home. And if you want to speak, I'll listen for as long as you want to talk, and I will not judge. And then they're usually off and running. And then at some point, we say to them, if I had been through what you've been through, I'm sure that like you, I would be having whatever it is, flashbacks, nightmares, whatever it is. And I hope you know that's not a mental illness. You're not crazy. Because the vets have said, nobody's ever told me that before. And it's a huge relief. And you know what? Then after they did the listening session, we asked the vets, how was it for you? Every single one said, nobody's ever given me a time and a place just to say what I need to say. They didn't ask me to define a military term. They didn't ask me what I did there. They didn't even compliment me in ways that might have made me uncomfortable. They just gave me the gift of getting to say what I needed to say. And for some of them, they remembered things they hadn't remembered. They made connections between things. Because, you know, trauma is very fragmenting. And so that's one reason that what gets called PTSD or generalized anxiety can be so hard to deal with if you're isolated, because it's just things are hitting you here and there, and there's nothing to connect. The connection comes when there's a human being who has sat and heard whatever you want to say. And that helps give form to these horrible fragments that have plagued you, in some cases for many decades. And I want to come back for just a second to talking about the families. When I spoke to the American Legion Auxiliary, I said, one of the reasons for the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home Project is because I want to take some of the burden off the families. So when somebody whose partner or spouse is in the military and comes back, and they say, oh, so I should listen to their story, I say, no, you should not be, certainly not the first one to listen. Because, as you said, in the family, it's just too fraught. The responsibilities and the tension can be enormous. So I've said to them, if you have a veteran in your family, you go find a veteran from some other family if you want to listen to their story. Let them start by talking to somebody outside their family. And after all, it's a democracy at that level too. When our government is making people suffer by sending them to war and then not helping them much when they come home, we all need to help.
And really part of it is the label itself.
Yes, yes.
It's a PTSD. What does that conjure up in your mind? I'm a big TV watcher,
yes,
you know,
yes.
And you think PTSD, oh, crazy veteran.
Yes, yes, and you know what? If you say to me, I have PTSD, all I know is you've been through something bad, right? Mm-hmm. If you say to me, what I experience is grief, or loss of innocence, or terror, or shame, that's very different. I get that, you know? And if you look at the words in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I have to tell you, Shal, I've been listening to veterans' stories for 10 years. Actually, it's still hard for me to say this. After what I've heard, to call what they have been through stress. You know, when I was trying to find where to meet you today, I couldn't find a place to park. That's stress. To call stress what people have been through, who've been to war and come home, I think I experience it as offensive because it minimizes it. It's not stress. And I want us to go back to using the words that the novelists and the poets and ordinary people used to use before psychiatry got to be so popular.
Are those terms like soldier's heart?
Soldier's heart is what they used to call it. Yes, in the Civil War. That's my favorite. And everything they've called it up to PTSD has made it clear that war did this.
Because really, no matter what your position, what your role, what your rank is in the service, war is going to change you.
That's right.
In one way or another, because either you can't get enough sleep because all you're doing is thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it,
Right.
or everything you do is impacted because you're so shut in and isolated, self-isolated, that you don't seek the treatment. Where or how do you persuade that person to really, take a chance on getting help? Ask your community.
Okay,
How do you do
yes,
that?
right, okay, I love that, I love that. I would just want to say, instead of saying to them, we want you to seek treatment, because treatment is, psychiatric, and the drugs, and that means you're mentally ill. I would say, we want you to seek connection. We want you to be open to connecting. And that's why I do the listening project, because one-on-one, in a private room, where it's all going to be confidential, and you never have to see the listener again if you don't want to. It's a safer place to try to say some of the things that have been plaguing you alone for all of this time. And so what Colonel Sutherland, whom I mentioned before, he says that what we have in this country is an epidemic of disconnection between veterans and civilians. And so first, it's up to us civilians to reach out. We shouldn't be saying, what's wrong with the vets? They won't rejoin the community.
Don't wait for them to come to you.
Absolutely.
You go out there and go to them.
Right. And the most important first step in persuading people in the community to reach out is to say, stop thinking they're mentally ill. And then if you, in my book, I talk about, let's use words like grief and shame and fear and moral anguish and loss of innocence, because that's something, everybody's experienced those things to some extent. We get it. To say PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder or bipolar disorder, that distances us from the person who's got the label.
But they still need that label
That's
to get the benefit, and
Okay.
that's the double-edged sword.
You're so right. And an Iraq war vet said to me recently, it should be possible to get services without being diagnosed. And he's absolutely right. So let me tell you what's happening. At Harvard Kennedy School, I organized a conference a year ago called A Better Welcome Home. And it was about alternative approaches to helping vets and their families.
Let's talk about some of those.
Okay, great. Because this, if you don't have to say, if you can just say, somebody's been to war, you shouldn't have to say they deserve services only if they have a psychiatric disorder. We should say if they've been to war, they deserve services, right? And we should stop thinking services mean psychotherapy and drugs, psychotherapy and drugs. So we had 29 different people, each presenting a different approach at that Harvard conference. And I can give you how to find it on the internet now. You'll see 29 5-minute videos, each person just saying in ordinary language, here's what I do to help vets without saying they're mentally ill and without using drugs. So everything from a woman who trains service dogs, to somebody from the Department of Defense who uses physical exercise, to somebody from the VA in Seattle, Washington, Dr. David Carney, who uses meditation, to people who work in the arts, to people who train vets to work in nonprofits. Because you know what, and my listening project, because I tell you what I have seen to make the most positive impact on vets, to get beyond the suffering. If you think of it, you're trained to go to war, so you're trained to attack, kill, and defame. Now you come home, you don't get very far if that's what you're doing all the time.
Well, yeah, and there's not a lot of job offers for that skill set
That's right.
in the civilian world these days.
That's right. So the two characteristics of what really helps people heal in all of these different ways, they are connection and creation. So
I love that, because you know what, being a sufferer myself of PTSD, part of the reason I do this TV show is to help me overcome those issues.
Yes.
And so
yes.
we created this series to get me out of the house,
Yes.
to get me asking the veterans questions. Well, how do you do this? I'm a veteran. How would I, if I walked in and saw you, how would you help me?
Well, I would say I would go to the community, the civilian community first, and say, go, if you Google Harvard Kennedy School, A Better Welcome Home, and YouTube, then you'll see these 29 different approaches. So everybody is interested in something, in music, in writing, in meditation. See what grabs you.
That's the therapy.
Right?
That's the therapy.
Yeah, but, well, I would say that's what helps healing. I'm trying to get away from the psychiatric model,
Okay,
right?
you're absolutely
I want to say, I don't want you to say you have PTSD. I want you to say you're suffering, because that makes us more similar to each other, you know, and that helps enhance the chances that we'll connect. So then once you, at this Harvard website, there's a contact person and contact information for every one of these 29 approaches, and you are encouraged to get in touch with them and see how you can help. So either if you live in their area, you can go and help in person. You can find out from them how to start in your area, what they're doing. You can send a donation. All of these groups need a lot more money. They don't have much. And so there are ways that anybody can help. And let me say one other thing. The reason that I keep hassling you about please don't use PTSD is this, that when I wrote the book, I said in the first chapter that I don't think Americans like to think about veterans very much, because who wants to think about war, who wants to think about upsetting things, and I hoped and prayed I'd be wrong. Well, here's what happened. A year and a half ago when the book came out, I started writing a blog for Psychology Today, and I also blog on the website for my book. For Psychology Today, I've written about 70 essays. About a dozen of them have had something or other to do with veterans. All the rest have been about a huge variety of other things unrelated to veterans. Well, they show you how many people have read each of your essays. And it is so I write a blog for Psychology Today, and since the book came out about a year and a half ago, I've written about 70 essays. About a dozen of those have been something or other related to veterans, and all the rest have been about a variety of subjects, a wide variety, unrelated to veterans. Well, you know, they show you how many people have read each essay, and it's so sad, because with one exception, every time I've written anything about veterans, it's gotten between 30% and 3% the number of views of any...
About ready to wrap up the program here, and Dr. Kaplan does have to go somewhere else. So please go ahead and continue.
Okay, should I start over with the psychology? I could say, and with one exception.
Yeah, there you go.
Right.
With one exception.
Yeah. So with one exception. Okay.
Okay, go.
So it's very sad, because with one exception, every time I've written anything to do with veterans, it's gotten between 30% and only 3% the number of views as any other subject I've ever written about on that blog.
And why do you think that is? Because the general public is not really interested, or because the veterans don't know that that information is out there?
No. It's the veterans are reading this. It's other people.
Okay.
It's the civilians. And I don't think it's that in principle the civilians aren't interested. It's that they don't have to care, and so they don't want to think about anything that A, is upsetting, and B, if they don't think they can do anything because all veterans are mentally ill, or because they don't know what to do, well, go to the Harvard Kennedy School website, 29 different ways that you can help. So I think that's what gets in the way. And then, of course, if they see a veteran and a veteran looks kind of shy or withdrawn or something, then they don't know what to say. And that's why on my website for the book, which is called When Johnny and Jane Come Marching, .weebly, weebly.com, you'll see on the homepage there are 2 9-minute videos. And the first one tells some of the common problems vets have. The second one is about this listening project, and it's how to do it. It's so simple. You know what? When people say, don't I have to get trained in order to do the listening session? I say, no. We used to call it friendship. We used to call it human connection. That's what this is about. And so I want it to be the case that in every community in this country where there's even one veteran, I want them to know that in that community there are 1 or 4 or 7 civilians who have sat and listened to veterans' stories and who get it, and who care.
And who care.
Yeah.
Listen
Yes.
to our stories.
Yes.
Dr. Kaplan, if someone out there would like to get in touch with you direct,
They can do it through the website. There's a contact form, and I would love to hear from people.
thank you so much
Thank
for what
you.
you're doing
Thank
for our
you
veterans.
for what you're doing. Thank you.
That's it. Jane, come marching home again. And this is just B-roll. It's just B-roll. So we're just plugging the book